is Africa. Marcus Messiah Garvey. His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie. Rasta is the political, the spiritual and the social all coming together. The truth of the matter is, Rasta is.
Zephaniah is an English writer, dub poet, a term I'll explain later, and a rastafari. You've just heard him talking a little bit about the Rastafari movement at the start of this video, what it is to be a Rasta. We don't need to go into too much detail there, but just important to establish that he's outside of mainstream English culture in the same way that John Agard is. And there are strong links between these two poems in the anthology. They're actually written in the same year, you may have noticed. Zephaniah was born in Handsworth, an area of Birmingham, which he called the Jamaican capital of Europe. He's the son of a postman from Barbados and a Jamaican nurse. He had a difficult education, if you can call it that. He was sent to an approved school for offenders, got in all manner of trouble and left there unable to read and write. He also had the barrier of dyslexia to overcome. However, he turned his life around, got his own education as an adult, and is now, of course, a fantastically successful writer. Because of that, he was offered an OBE in 2003, an Order of the British Empire. You see one here. But he's one of only a handful of people in history who have refused that honour. He explained why, saying, "Me? I thought. Up yours, I thought. I get angry when I hear the word empire. It reminds me of slavery. It reminds of thousands of years of brutality. It reminds me how my foremothers were raped and my forefathers brutalised. Benjamin Zephaniah OBE? No way, Mr. Blair. No way, Mrs. Queen. I am profoundly anti-empire." So Zephaniah is certainly a man of deeply held beliefs, and he's politically very engaged. He said that he wants to use his poetry as a vehicle to reach people. His mission is to destroy the image of poetry as representing the voice of dead white men. And so his endeavour is to take poetry to the people. He does a lot of work in schools, actually. He's an animal rights advocate. He's spoken against homophobia in Jamaica. He's in favour of a British Republic. He would stop the monarchy if he could, and you probably picked that up in his remarks about the OBE. He's also fought to change our voting system to make it more fair. So he is, as I said before, really engaged. Most relevant to this poem, though, is his anti-racism work. He's made a video recently on the impact of policing in a black community, and I've already mentioned that as a young black teenager he had his own brush with the law, so personal experience of that. So you won't be surprised to hear that in No Problem, which we're going to hear him read in just a second, Zephaniah is making a point. He's making a point about racism, about ignorance, stereotypical views about what it means to be black, about prejudice, and about the need to put the record straight. So here's the poem, Zephaniah's own voice.
No problem. I am not the problem, but I bear the brunt of silly playground taunts and racist stunts. I am not the problem. I am a born academic, but they got me on the run. Now I'm branded athletic. I am not the problem. If you give me a chance, I'll teach you of Timbuktu. I can do more than dance. I am not the problem. I greet you with a smile. You put me in a pigeonhole, but I am versatile. Well, these conditions may affect me. as I get older, and I am positively sure I have no chips upon my shoulders. Black is not the problem. Mother country, get it right. And just for the record, some of my best friends are white.
I've said already that Zephaniah is a dub poet. Dub poetry is a form of performance poetry that came out of the West Indies. So another link with Agard's poem, Half Caste, also performance poem, as we've learned. It came out of dub music, which consisted of the spoken word over reggae rhythms. And that form developed in Jamaica in the late 1970s. So musicality is a really important feature of dub poems, but dub poets, like Zephaniah, generally perform without background music. The musicality is instead created through chanted speech with very emphasised rhythms, and dub poets also emphasise gesture as they're performing. Most dub poetry is political and social in nature. The poets are concerned with social justice, promoting social justice, and you'll have picked that up from No Problem. Here are the first 4 lines of the poem. It is in fact written in 2 stanzas. The first is the longest, it's 16 lines altogether. Second is rather shorter. Mentioned already the important feature of musicality, rhythm, and you can see that that's created in part by the rhyme. The first 16 lines can be divided into 4 quatrains, and they follow an A-B rhyme scheme. So each quatrain begins with that emphatic statement, I am not the problem. You can see that rhyming with problem here is taunt, so it's actually at best a half rhyme, but the B rhymes, brunt and stunts, are very strong all the way through. And the rhyme scheme tends to emphasise key words, as we'll see when we look at use of language. The fact that they rhyme reinforces them, makes them stand out for the listener. Most English poetry is written in what we call iambic feet, which basically means you have sequences of unstressed and stressed syllables, which sound like this. Da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. Zephaniah here is reversing that. I am not the problem. So dum, de dum, de dum. So he's using trochaic feet, and there are 3 of these, 3 stressed syllables in most of the lines, although he does play around with the rhythm, as you would expect. In terms of the sequencing of ideas in the poem, there is a shift between the first long stanza and the second shorter one. In the first, Zephaniah, talking from the point of view of a black student, is exploring a series of racial stereotypes and explaining how stultifying they are for him, how he is put in a pigeonhole by his contemporaries. Although, important to note that at the end of the stanza, he does triumphantly state that he has escaped that pigeonhole. In the second stanza, he speculates how these conditions that he's grown up in might affect him in the future. He also prevents this from being a poem just about his experience as a black schoolboy by replacing I am not the problem with black is not the problem. So he's making a general point in the final stanza about the black experience and about the fact that the problem actually is the establishment. So this isn't a poem about individuals, about his school days. It's a poem about racism within English society. As I said earlier, dub poetry tends to be about social justice, the social and political rather than just the personal. So we've already established that this is a first-person poem, Zephaniah drawing on his own experience, also using his own voice, just as John Agard does in Half Caste. His Jamaican Creole is a key feature of the poem, and you'll see that there are significant differences between that Creole language and Standard English. Like Agard, Zephaniah is proudly asserting his cultural identity and indicating that this is a perspective from outside mainstream English culture. The poem's also written to be performed, as we've seen. He's a performance poet, and that's why he's used the spoken form of the language, not its written form. Remember as well his aim to bring poetry to the people. His use of the spoken form certainly brings it to life, gives it a fresh energy and an authenticity. Just as each phase of Agard's poem begins, explain yourself what you mean when you say half caste, so each phase of this poem, certainly in the first stanza, begins, I am not the problem. This creates a strident tone, an emphatic tone. Zephaniah is standing up for himself. He is asserting his innocence. He is not the problem. Notice the alliteration on b and d, which adds to this strident tone. Not the problem, but I bear the brunt. We also have the hissing sibilants of silly playground taunts and racist stunts. The words brunt and stunts are of course linked through the rhyme scheme, and that underlines this theme of unfairness. To bear the brunt means to get more than your fair share of something bad. So he's singled out for abuse on the playground, and that's because of racism. We don't even have to infer that. These are racist stunts. This next quatrain, beginning with that familiar I am not the problem, explores the stereotype of the black male as being athletic. It's a stereotype which is deeply offensive, of course. Anything which says that a group of people share certain characteristics is dehumanising. Zephaniah uses the verb branded to show that this is a label that he's been given. In fact, I am born academic. In fact, he is a reader, a writer, a thinker. People don't see that, they just see the stereotype. That line, but they got me on the run, is an interesting play on words. Of course, being on the run means that you're trying to avoid capture. And clearly what threatens to capture Zephaniah is stereotypical thinking. But in a playful twist, by metaphorically running away from that thinking, from that racism, he's branded athletic, so he can't win. This quatrain introduces another racial stereotype. We've had the black man as athletic, and now there's that notion of black men being good dancers, good movers. Again, really offensive, and he's complaining in this stanza that he doesn't get the chance to even explain that there's more to him than the stereotype. He says, I can teach you of Timbuktu. Timbuktu is a city in Mali, West Africa, and what he's saying is that he has knowledge, he has interesting things to say, he has a perspective perhaps that people around him don't have and could learn from, but he can't share that perspective. He doesn't have a chance, to quote from the poem, because he's just seen as a black man, an athlete, a dancer, not a thinker. In this final phase of the first stanza, the last 4 lines, we discover that the racism that has surrounded him and the stereotyping which he's been victim of hasn't thwarted his spirit. I greet you with a smile. There's a lovely lightness about that. And he says in the last line, I am versatile, suggesting that whilst people have tried to categorise him, they've tried to put him in a pigeonhole labelled black person, he's used his versatility to escape that. So the first stanza presented a series of stereotypes. This stanza becomes more reflective, opens out somewhat. And so does the rhythm and rhyme. It's much less structured. It's freer, and that's appropriate given that we're now hearing his thoughts rather than the thoughts of those who think in cliché and stereotype. So what are his thoughts? Well, remember, the voice we're hearing is that of Zephaniah as a schoolboy. He's not speaking as an adult, but putting himself into the shoes of his younger self. And his younger self speculates in his final stanza that these conditions, this racism, may affect me as I get older. I have no chips on my shoulders is an important line, because somebody with a chip on the shoulder is somebody who has a grudge, who's got what you might call an inferiority complex. In other words, somebody who has something wrong with themselves. So this phrase can be used to dismiss people's legitimate concerns. So if somebody complains about their treatment as a black person, you say they have a chip on the shoulder, you're really saying, problem's not with society, it's with you. Now clearly, that is not a way of addressing real issues, and Zephaniah is saying here, emphatically, that he has no chip on his shoulder. This is a real issue. And he will not be silenced by that derisory, dismissive term that comes from the mainstream. That's why Zephaniah in the next line says, not I am not the problem, but black is not the problem. It shows that he's not just speaking as an individual, but as a representative of the black community. And that black community isn't the problem. Perhaps it's with some bitterness, some irony, that Zephaniah uses the phrase mother country. Mother country is the country that you're born in. So he's making the point that this is his mother country. He is British, and yet he hasn't had the respect that he's deserved as a human being, as a citizen. He finishes by insisting again that this isn't a personal perspective, it's a social and political message in this poem, because for the record, some of my best friends are white. Of course, there's some bitter irony in that last line as well, because references to having friends in particular groups are always used by people who try to absolve themselves of any criticisms of prejudice. So you might say, I'm not homophobic, I have a gay friend. I'm not racist, I have friends who are black. So Zephaniah is here ridiculing that idea, really. When you think about it, it is ridiculous to state that because you have one friend, then you have positive feelings about all of the people in that group. Really, it's a form of stereotyping again, isn't it? And above all else, this is a poem that really attacks the notion of stereotyping and reveals it in all of its lazy, crass absurdity. So the key themes in this poem are, of course, racism and the stereotypical thinking that underpins racism. It's also about inequality and our need as a society to hear the legitimate concerns of people who are marginalised, who are victims of racism. It also explores language, the way we use language sometimes to silence those concerns, to dismiss them. But the poem also celebrates resilience, triumph over these conditions, the speaker's ability to be versatile, ultimately to become everything a black person isn't supposed to be. That is, a reader, a writer, a thinker, a scholar, not a football player or a dancer. When you reflect on the fact that Zephaniah was kicked out of school, that really is some achievement.